Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into some really fascinating stuff today about race.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of rethinking everything we thought we knew about it.
Hmm.
We're looking at an excerpt from Paul Gilroy's The Crisis of Race and Raciology.
Yeah,
And
a good one.
pretty mind-bending.
It really is.
Yeah.
He says we're kind of in this crisis,
Okay.
and it's not a crisis of race itself.
Uh-huh.
It's a crisis of how we understand it.
Right.
And he calls this raciology.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit.
Sure.
Why is the concept of race in crisis?
Well, one reason is that the idea of race as like a fixed biological category
Right.
is kind of becoming harder and harder to defend.
Yeah.
Advances in genetics,
Mm-hmm.
particularly genomics,
Yeah.
have shown just how complex and fluid human variation really is.
Okay.
So we're finding that those old, rigid racial classifications, they
Wow.
just don't really hold up to scientific scrutiny anymore.
Okay, so science is saying race is more of a social construct
Right.
than
Oh.
biological fact.
Yeah.
If that's the case,
Yeah.
then why does it still feel so real?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
That's really the heart of the crisis Gilroy is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the science is shifting, what he calls raciology,
Mm-hmm.
the discourse, stereotypes, and power structures that we've built around these racial categories,
Uh-huh.
those things haven't disappeared.
Right. It's like, even if we know intellectually that race isn't this fixed reality,
Mm-hmm.
it still shapes how we experience the world
Exactly.
and how we relate to each other.
Yeah. And Gilroy has some good examples
Good.
to help us understand this. Take Henrietta Lacks and her immortal HeLa cells.
Right. Her cells were used in all these breakthroughs.
Yeah, countless scientific breakthroughs.
But her story brings up so many ethical questions
It does.
about race and consent.
Huge questions, but it also exposes this irony about how race operates.
Okay.
Even in science, researchers were using her cells,
Right.
assuming they were like a universal human template.
Right.
But actually, their own racial biases interfered with their understanding of her cells.
Wait, so their assumptions about blackness
Yeah.
got in the way of the science?
Yeah, exactly. Like, they were blinded by their preconceptions about race,
Wow.
even as they were saying they were studying something purely biological.
It's a good point. It's like, even in the supposedly objective realm of science, we can't escape the shadow of race and raciology.
You got it. And this leads to another key point that Gilroy makes,
Okay.
the emergence of what he calls new racism.
Okay, so what's new about this racism?
Well, it's different from those older, more blatant kinds of prejudice, because instead of relying on overt biological justifications for racial superiority, this new racism focuses on cultural and national differences.
Okay.
It's less about saying one race is biologically superior
Got it.
and more about framing certain cultures as incompatible or threatening or just out of place.
So it's kind of a more subtle form of prejudice, but still based on those ideas about racial difference.
Exactly. And he uses this example of the rise of these ultranationalist movements in Europe. They often frame their anxieties about immigration and cultural change in racialized terms.
Even if they don't use the language of biological race.
Exactly.
So they might say, we're not racist, but...
Right.
And then just make arguments based on fear and prejudice.
Exactly.
Towards certain groups.
That's how it works.
Wow. It seems like this new racism might be even harder to call out.
It is. It flies under the radar.
Yeah.
So Gilroy says it's so important to understand how raciology operates.
Right.
It's not just about discrimination. It's those underlying beliefs.
The systems of thought.
Yeah, that shape how we see and interact with each other.
Okay, so we're buying Gilroy's argument here.
Yeah.
That race is scientifically shaky, but raciology has a grip on society. Where do we go from here?
That is when things get really interesting. Gilroy proposes an alternative. He calls it planetary humanism.
Planetary humanism?
Yeah.
Okay, what does that even mean?
It's like a call
Okay.
to move beyond these narrow, divisive identities based on race or nation or any other category that separates us.
Okay.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness and vulnerability on this planet.
So focusing on what unites us as humans rather than divides us.
Exactly.
Finding that common ground.
You got it. He gives some interesting examples
Okay.
for how this might look. He talks about how militaries are adapting to having female soldiers.
Wow.
Which is challenging those traditional assumptions about gender roles
Okay.
and who's capable of serving.
So even institutions as rigid as the military are shifting toward a more inclusive view of human potential.
That's what he's saying. To him, these are glimpses of what planetary humanism might look like. A world where we move beyond these rigid categories.
Of race and gender.
Yeah, and recognize a more fluid, interconnected understanding of being human.
Okay, but I mean, how do we actually get there?
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges.
Because even if we get that race is a social construct, it doesn't just magically disappear.
Yeah, right.
We're still dealing with the legacy of racism, inequality, and these deep emotional attachments people have to these categories.
That's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore those challenges, the complexities of identity, and the potential pitfalls of trying to completely abandon race.
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
But it's a crucial conversation to have.
I agree.
So if you're ready to keep going on this fascinating journey with us,
Yeah.
join us for part 2
It'll be good.
of our deep dive into Paul Gilroy's work.
Yeah.
See you there. Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about Paul Gilroy's argument that race is scientifically shaky, but it doesn't just go away.
Right.
And he was talking about this new kind of racism that's emerging.
Yeah, the new racism. And one of the things Gilroy points out is how this new racism is showing up in our visual landscape,
Okay.
especially in consumer culture.
Okay. I'm curious about that.
Mm-hmm.
How is the visual landscape of race changing?
Well, we're seeing more and more non-white models and celebrities.
Okay.
Think about advertising, fashion, movies.
Right.
There's definitely more diversity than there used to be.
Right. And that seems like a good thing.
Yeah.
Like more representation, more inclusivity.
On the surface, it does seem like a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But Gilroy says, hold on.
Okay.
Don't just assume that more diverse faces means that racial hierarchies are being dismantled.
So it's like representation matters,
Yeah.
but it's not the whole solution.
Right. It's not enough to just have more diverse bodies in ads or on magazine covers.
Okay.
We need to look deeper.
At the power dynamics.
Yeah, at the messages that those images are actually conveying.
To see if they're really challenging stereotypes?
Exactly. Or just reinforcing them in new ways.
Wow, okay.
Think about Michael Jackson and his physical transformation.
Right.
That was a huge cultural moment. And it sparked all kinds of conversations about race, identity, and beauty standards.
Yeah, everyone had an opinion on what his changing appearance meant.
Exactly. It was really complex.
Yeah.
And Gilroy says, look at this as an example of how these visual changes don't necessarily mean liberation from race.
So even as these rigid ideas about race are being challenged, we might be creating new ones.
That's the question he's raising.
Okay.
He also brings up this trend of Black celebrities modifying their appearance.
Okay.
With tattoos, piercings, branding, you know?
Yeah.
Are these just personal choices?
Uh-huh.
Or are they still operating within a framework of racial expectations?
That's a really interesting question. Are those modifications challenging the old norms?
Mm-hmm.
Or just conforming to a different set of standards?
Right. Like, are we really moving beyond race? Or just kind of shifting the goalposts a bit?
Okay, so Gilroy wants us to think critically about all this.
He does. He wants us to question these seemingly progressive changes.
Yeah.
And ask if they're really getting at the root of raciology.
Okay, so how do we go beyond just changing the visuals?
Yeah. How do we actually challenge these underlying systems?
What does it really take?
Well, for Gilroy, it starts with recognizing that race isn't biological.
Okay.
It's a social construct with real-world consequences.
Right.
To challenge those consequences, we have to go beyond just addressing discrimination.
Look at the subtle ways race is embedded in everything.
Exactly.
Our institutions, our culture, our own biases.
It's much deeper work. So now we come back to the alternatives.
Okay.
What might a world beyond race look like?
Right. We talked about planetary humanism earlier,
Yeah.
but I mean, how do we actually get there?
It is a huge task, but Gilroy doesn't think it's impossible.
Okay.
He thinks that by abandoning race and embracing a more inclusive vision of humanity,
Okay.
we can create a better world. And he does offer some glimpses.
Oh, I'd like to hear about that. What kind of future does he see?
Well, he talks about things like decolonizing knowledge,
Okay.
challenging those old Eurocentric narratives
Right.
that have dominated history and science.
Yeah.
He also talks about recognizing and valuing the cultural contributions of groups that have been marginalized.
So it's about broadening our understanding of what it means to be human.
Exactly.
What knowledge is, what progress looks like.
Yeah, moving beyond those narrow perspectives
Okay.
that have excluded so many people.
So it ties into that idea of planetary humanism.
It does.
But it's not about creating some colorblind utopia.
No, it's about recognizing the richness of diversity while also understanding our interconnectedness as humans.
So our differences are part of what makes us human,
Right.
but they shouldn't be used to justify oppression or inequality.
You got it. And that's why Gilroy says abandoning race isn't just some intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
It's a moral imperative.
To create a world where we don't define ourselves or others by the color of their skin or their culture.
Where those categories don't carry the weight of history, oppression, and violence anymore.
It's a powerful vision.
It is.
But I'm also thinking about the challenges.
Yeah.
As we try to move beyond race, what are some things we need to be aware of?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something we'll explore in the next part of our discussion.
Okay.
We'll look at the complexities of identity,
Okay.
the potential for erasure,
Yeah.
and the need to address the material consequences of racism,
Right.
even as we work toward the world beyond race.
This has been a really great conversation.
Yeah.
I hope our listeners are thinking about these ideas too.
Me too.
So if you're ready to keep going,
Yeah.
join us for the last part of our deep dive into Gilroy's work.
It'd be good.
So we're back, and I'm still kind of stuck on this idea of moving beyond race,
Yeah.
but also remembering how real it is in the world.
Right.
Like, how do we do both?
It's tough.
Yeah.
And Gilroy gets that. He doesn't shy away from the hard stuff. He brings up this point about abandoning race, that it could lead to erasure.
Erasure. What do you mean?
He's saying if we just get rid of the category of race,
Okay.
but we don't change the power structures and inequality,
Right.
then we're ignoring the people who've been hurt because of it.
So it's like saying, we're not going to talk about race,
Yeah.
but we also don't talk about slavery.
Yeah. Or colonialism.
Right.
Or discrimination.
That still affects people today.
Exactly. And he says some groups have built their whole identity and their culture of resistance
Yeah.
around this idea of race.
Right.
So if you erase that category, you might be erasing their history and struggles.
It's like saying we're all just human,
Yeah,
but that ignores what people have gone through because of their race.
exactly. Gilroy says we have to acknowledge those experiences,
Yeah.
even as we try to build a world where race doesn't have so much power.
Okay, so how do we do both?
Right. How do we get rid of the bad stuff,
Yeah.
but honor the good stuff? Gilroy thinks we should shift from individual identity to collective action.
Okay.
He says the fight against racism isn't about finding yourself.
Okay.
It's about changing the systems that create inequality.
So it's not who am I racially,
Right.
but how can we all work together to fix this?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And he thinks if we focus on justice and equality, we can overcome our differences
Yeah.
and build something better.
But I'm thinking about fear.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like fear is a big part of prejudice.
Absolutely. And Gilroy knows that.
Like if you can make people afraid of others, you can control them
Yeah.
and justify discrimination
You see it all the time.
with politicians.
Oh, yeah.
Using fear to get votes.
It's a classic tactic. And that fear takes many forms.
Fear of other cultures.
Yeah.
Fear of economic competition. Fear of crime.
It all comes down to ignorance and stereotypes.
Which the media and politicians just make worse.
It's a cycle.
Fear creates prejudice. Prejudice creates discrimination.
And discrimination reinforces the fear.
So how do we break that cycle?
Gilroy says we need to address the fear itself.
Okay, but how?
Well, he thinks empathy and understanding are key.
So learning about other people's experiences?
Exactly, listening to their stories to break down those walls of fear.
It's like realizing we're all human even if we're different.
Yeah, and that our differences are valuable.
Not something to be afraid of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what Gilroy's vision is all about.
Not erasing our differences
Right.
or pretending racism doesn't exist.
It's about creating a world where those differences don't lead to fear and oppression.
Where everyone can just thrive.
Exactly. It's a beautiful vision.
It is, but I imagine getting there won't be easy.
It won't. But Gilroy gives us a way to think about these issues
To understand race and raciology.
so we can build a better future.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
I hope our listeners are leaving with some new ideas.
Me too.
And a sense of hope.
Yeah, a world beyond race is possible.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for that better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.